Welcome back to Immersion Talks, and we're continuing our conversation around an introduction to Hoplology with Mike Belzer Sensei. So last time we had discussed how we got here, the whole story with how Mike Belzer met with Don Draeger and his correspondence with Richard Hayes, coming up with all the letters, the textbooks, and then going ahead and actually reading it out with painful detail, one paragraph at a time, to at least three people: Chip Hunter Armstrong, David Hall, and finally he was kind enough to do it with myself. So what we're going to do is, this is some heavy stuff. It can be heavy, can be overwhelming, and since I spent quite some time actually condensing it so that we can get it in bite-sized pieces. So maybe one of the things we want to do today is start with an overlay of the 8 traits, and we'll get into more details of what these traits are. This forms the guts of the Draeger-Hayes Hoplology, if you will, and then get into some more concepts as time allows, like what it means to be system-bound, system-free, and 3 kinds of lands you find ourselves in. So with that, Sensei, welcome aboard. And again, thank you for taking this time. Good. So how about we just jump in with an overview of what the 8 traits are, Sensei?
Okay, so good to be back. And so what Hayes was trying to do was describe what he called the upland of human performance, or combative human performance, under the threat of a life and death threatening emergency. So he broke it down into what he called the lowland, the midland, and the upland. But we can't really talk about what those lands are like, the description, without getting into at least an overview of the traits. And these traits are combative traits that are present in everyone, because genetically we all have capacities, and through training we can develop those capacities. Some might have a high capacity for one aspect, a lower capacity for another aspect, but through training in these various combative disciplines, you can raise your level of ability. So I'd like to just kind of read the 8 different traits, and I'm going to read them in English, but then I'm going to give you a Japanese equivalent, because we have to remember that this came from people that were in the Japanese Koryu, or classical Bujutsu experience. Don Draeger was the first foreigner allowed to learn 2 of the most famous disciplines in Japan in terms of Koryu. First was Shindo Musoryu Jojutsu, the 4-foot staff, which is really connected with the police. It's considered a police art. And then the next one is Katori Shintoryu, which is a 650-year-old discipline. And that was a battlefield art that had multiple weapons: spear, naginata, sword, short sword, learning how to do fortifications, signaling, even espionage. So from those experiences, there's something called the Bu-no-ri, or principles of combat. And over hundreds of generations, the Bu-no-ri were identified, described, and cataloged by the Bushi, the samurai culture of Japan. They were very good at logging this type of information in their densho, or their scrolls. And so again, as Hayes and Draeger are going back and forth in letters, they're starting to bring some of these traits out, talk about them, and understand that, we have to take it out of the Japanese context, because we want this to be a worldwide discipline, and we want to be able to describe different styles and systems from all over the world. So I'm just going to list the 8 traits right now in English: force yield, synchronicity, equipoise, vocality, respiratory, abdominal, cognitive, intuitive, volition, and then a combination or a synergy of all of them together called TS of the MAT, or transcendent synergy of the manifest adaptive traits. That's a mouthful. And because it's a mouthful, in the letters going back and forth, they referred mainly to the Japanese terms for these traits because it was just easier. It was shorter, it was easier, they knew what they were talking about. For example, force, yield, Japanese goju. Synchronicity, aiki. Equipoise, mu kamai. Mu means empty, kamai, stance, so it's a stance that's ready for anything. Ki, vocality, respiratory. The abdominal is hara, which connects the upper and the lower. Cognitive intuitive is kangai to kan. Kangai is thinking, kan is intuition. And then finally, volition is sen, the ability to initiate an action or withhold an action. And then the last one, number 8, which was really, they spent most time working on this and trying to describe it. They called it flat mind or imperturbable mind, fudoshin. The best way to explain that would be if there's a hurricane and there's chaos all around us, where is the safest place to be? In the eye of the hurricane. That's where you'll find calm. We've heard of warriors being calm, cool, and collected under fire. This is the ideal of the warrior. That's the flat mind. They're not affected by the experiences of being adrenalized. Now that's the ideal. Most of us are in the imperturbable mind, or I'm sorry, the imperturbable mind, which means you are slightly juiced. You're juiced to the point where you can still operate, but you're not in what's called a maladaptive phase, panic, rage, fear, where you become ineffective. So you're able to use the juice of adrenaline to your advantage, but it's not taking over the situation. So those are the 8 traits, the imperturbable or flat mind being the linchpin that allows these others to manifest. And you have the innate genetic role of the die. My ability to deal with fear is different than your ability to deal with fear. My ability to blend with another person's force is different than yours. Everybody has different traits. The manifest expression of these traits is called the MAT, the manifest adaptive trait. So you've got innate and manifest. Combining them all together, it's a synergy, and that's also in Japan and Japanese known as Zanshin. And Zanshin is like a 360-degree awareness of what is going around you with an attitude of continual domination of the situation. That's the best I can do for a quick overview. All right. So there are the 8 traits. There's the combination of the 8 traits. Being the sum of the 8 is more than just the individual ones. By listing and identifying those traits, you can look at a system, a combative discipline, and you can start to see, oh, there's some goju right there. Wow, there's some awesome aiki. Ah, there's a good example of hara. You know, I can see their style doesn't use an audible ki, but it uses like a silent ki. So you can start, you're starting to know what to look for. Along those lines, there's 2 concepts. They called it system bound and system free. I prefer system found and system free. System bound sounds a little negative to me. You're kind of bound up. Nobody wants to be bound up. But what they meant by system bound is it's found or bound in the system. If you're watching some sort of combative encounter, that and they're expressing what they've learned in their training, it's within that system, so it's bound in that system. System free would be what we would call everyday life. You know, we're not in a combative situation every day. Most of the time we're not. So life is system free. Here's the example. Recently, I was walking across a sidewalk. I happened to be walking across the grassy little median between the sidewalk and the curb, and my foot went into a depression. It actually was a hole. Bam, I went face first right down on the ground. Just, it was that fast. Now, normally something like that happens if you have a little bit of time to react. You might be able to roll out of it. A lot of us have done that before. I've done that before. This one, no. Bam. Caught me completely by surprise. I'm face down. I'm on my hands. I push up. I get up. And all I have are mud prints on my hand because it had rained the night before. No scrapes, no scrapes. No mud on my torso, nothing on my pants, nothing. Like, what happened? I must have done like a yoga plank, and you know, boom, oh, like that. But it happened in a second. Now, to me, that's impressive enough that I didn't go face first. But because of various things that I've got going on, arthritis being one of them, it's amazing that I didn't sprain a wrist, break a wrist, dislocate a shoulder, break a collarbone, fall flat on my face. Then standing up, feeling like, okay, how's the neck? What's going on? Anything injured? No, everything was fine. And I also knew that the next day I would also be fine because it didn't feel like anything different than any other hard fall I'd taken over the years. So I would say that would be a system-free example of many things. Goju would be one of them. Aiki would be another. And we could probably find others in there too. And system-free experiences are probably the best way to try to get a handle on becoming aware of these traits because we're doing it every day. I have paused. Do you have any feedback or questions?
No, I
Okay, Mahipal, I've just lost your volume. Yeah, I've just lost you.
okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're back.
Oh, this is so weird. Sorry. No, I was saying,
Oh, off again.
Sorry about that.
No.
I was saying, you know, I think we those of us in the Japanese arts, we kind of get used to this, bringing it to everyday life, and especially to people who may not have had a Koryu or a classical education. Like you said, Sensei, the idea of being system found or system bound is almost seen negative, especially here in the West. But in so many ways, my experience or my bias right now on this is that those are the basics, you know, and you want to do the basics correctly. And until you're not within a system, the ability to become system free is far-fetched, if you will. I understand the seductive idea of my personal expression, me being able to pull this off, but that's a luxury that happens. And if we go down that path, usually what happens is you're going to have to learn the same mistakes that our ancestors did before us the hard way. So even though the notion of system found or system bound, especially to us here as Westerners, is kind of seen a little negatively, it has deep deep roots and deep advantages of doing it. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on that spectrum. I almost see it as a spectrum rather than two two opposing
Well,
things.
I think it's just important that we keep the big picture in mind. And as Hayes and Draeger were working on developing the textbook, they considered the big contribution to Hoplology is the explanation of these traits, the identification of the traits, and being able to find them in different styles and systems that they were doing research on. So it's important, I think, not to get lost necessarily in the details, but Hoplology is evolving, and this was back in 1978, 79, 80, 81, 82, like that, and it's their contribution along with their supporting other categories that they put down in this conceptual tools that we put together. And that's where we're jumping into that to try to get an experience of what they were contributing from their experiences. For example, let's talk about the lowland. I'm going to just read what I wrote about this, if you don't mind.
Yes, of course.
The lowland of performance is the dojo, the gym, randori, sparring. There is no real life threatening danger in these situations. Many aspects of what goes on in these settings is known in advance and can be prepared for. There are rules to follow and referees to watch for violations and ensure the safety of participants. Medical help is ready and available. Participants are adrenalized, but there's an internal knowledge that I'm not fighting for my life. I can always come back and try it again. So I use the Grand Canyon, viewing the Grand Canyon as an example. And so I'm going to take you on a little thought visualization. Let's say that you're a young kid, maybe 9 or 10, and you're on the tour bus and you're going to go see the Grand Canyon, and you get off the tour bus and you see a fence, and that fence will allow you to go up and look over and look at the Grand Canyon safely. You might run up to the fence, grab the fence and look over and go, wow, that's so awesome. It's amazing. I can't believe what I'm seeing. Then you get back in the bus. And then you go along a little bit more, and then the bus driver says, okay, we can get out and you can approach the edge, but please don't get too close because there is no safety barrier there. The way most people would approach would be much different than the way they did before, walking up, no care in the world, looking over. They would approach more slowly as they got closer, especially if nobody was watching and they wanted to get a better look. They might be moving with one leg forward, might be leaning over real slow. It's taking a lot more caution. Why? Because if they make a mistake, it's very hard to go back. They might tumble over. So there's an element of danger. And that's kind of the distinguishing characteristic of the lowland. Again, it's not a judgment. Most of us are hanging out in the lowland most of the time, because we're not in life-threatening situations on a daily basis. So the midland, what characterizes the midland? Self-defense, fighting for your life, police use of force, battlefield combat. There is real life-threatening danger in this kind of environment. The environment is uncertain, tense, and evolving. This is where we hear of Murphy's Law: anything that can go wrong will, and no plan survives first contact comes into play. Don Draeger talked about the Koryu ratio. There are only 3 outcomes when 2 warriors face each other. If I am better than you, I will win, but I might suffer injury. If you are better than me, you will win, but you might suffer injury. And if we're equal in skill, we will both die. So the Koryu ratio means that 2/3 of the time the warrior dies. This causes him to be extremely conservative in what he's willing to try and stick with the tried and true learned in his system of training when he's actually having to put his skills to the test. Responding to the natural fear response of fight, flee, and freeze is a critical component of the midland of combative performance and behavior. Being able to deal with all the effects of getting adrenalized, auditory exclusion, tunnel vision, the shakes, tachypsychia, the slowing down, perception of slowing down of time, super strength, imperviousness to pain, is the key to being able to perform effectively at this midland level of performance. The ideal is to be calm, cool, and collected, flat mind. And there are many accounts of warriors operating at this level. The reality is that most people are affected in a variety of ways that interfere with their performance. And it's only through realistic training that recreates the likely scenarios that one is to face that you can effectively prepare for this kind of life-threatening experience. Things can go from 0 to 100 in a split second, and the ability to mentally keep it together and not be overwhelmed by the experience, which results in freezing or ineffective action, is part of the imperturbable mind that's approaching flat mind, but not quite there. Where is the safest place to be in a hurricane? The center of the eye. The imperturbable mind knows this also through training, and he or she seeks the center of the action. And then we'll get into the upland. So midland has to do with actually dealing with a life-threatening situation. And that doesn't mean that every police officer is operating in the midland at every moment of their patrol time, or that every soldier or warrior is operating at that level. It's when it's going down that there's an opportunity to be operating in the midland. As far as the upland goes, and we have to now get into the personality of Richard Hayes. Richard Hayes was a veteran of not World War II, but Korea. He had some experiences there, and he didn't really go into the details in the letters to me, but he had experiences or was part of experiences where he witnessed the upland of performance under a life or death situation. And so he was always trying to explain that, to get to it. And he said, the traits, the combative traits, the 8 combative traits allowed him and Don Draeger to start discussing these levels of performance. The upland. This level of combative performance has the same life or death element depending on what is done and how it is done. Many times this is characterized by withholding an action, not overreacting, and still getting the job done. Someone watching the encounter might call it sublime. Now, the triptych of the flute player, Yasumase, and the brigand who is waiting to attack is a perfect example, and that is why Hayes uses that as an example of the upland. Because the flute master is at one with his music and his flute, the fact that he is potentially going to be attacked is not affecting him. He is aware, and in fact, I'm not sure if the triptych shows this, but you might even see that the eyes are slightly, to the left, so that he is seeing that there is a threat over here. But
This,
go
Sensei,
ahead.
if I may just one sec. So, because it'll only show my screen when I'm talking. So this
Yeah.
is the image that Sensei is talking about, guys. So this is the flute master and the image. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you, Sensei, because when you're talking,
It's
it'll just
okay.
show you.
So what's happening here is the flute master just continues on his way, not in ignorance. He knows what might potentially happen, but his flute playing and his music is not disturbed. He is showing no opening, and with no opening, there is no way to attack. The brigand doesn't attack, and then as the flute player walks on, there you go, it's over. So there was no opening of attack, and that was the flat mind as captured in that woodblock print. We also have a little clip of a video called The Tea Master, and I think a lot of us have heard about this story, but I just recently saw it in the movie called Tea Master, and it's great. It talks about a tea master who has offended a samurai. The samurai says, "I'm going to return the next morning and I'm going to kill you. Prepare to die." And so the tea master finds another samurai, asks, "How can I learn to defend myself?" And is basically told, "You can't. You should just prepare to die. But first make tea and act like you are making tea." And so that's what he does. Do we want to show that now?
Yes.
Where did you get that? What a dishonor! Tomorrow, once the sun has risen, you and I will meet with swords. I will right this wrong. Excuse me. Pick up your sword. I'm sorry. I had too much sake to drink last night. I stumbled upon your fire and must have fallen asleep. I am at your debt. Can you teach me? A master never gives away his secrets. You're a sword master? I am. Then you must teach me. And why is that? The samurai has challenged me to a duel. Then tomorrow you will die. No, wait. Stop. Where did you get that? The Emperor. What can you offer the Emperor to receive an Imperial sword? I serve him tea. So you are the tea master. I will teach you. But first you must serve me tea. Your mastery of the ceremony is remarkable. Will you teach me now? No. What? What will I do? Just serve tea.
I'm sorry. I was mistaken.
So sometimes
Brilliant.
even if it's a movie, we can get a glimpse of what these traits are and how they interact. By even if it's a movie, I mean, you know, it's all contrived. And this is another reason why I like watching things that are caught on tape, encounters that are actually caught on tape, because then you can see reality as it's playing out. But sometimes the movies do a really good job too. And this was a good one that really shows an aspect of the upland where there is no fighting. And we're talking about, Hoplology is talking about human combative performance, but the upland tends to be a little bit less is better than a little bit more. And Hayes talks about that. Another aspect about the upland, and I think we saw it here in the Tea Master, component of the upland of performance is a concept that Richard and DFD identified from the Koryu, which is called Makoto. They translated Makoto as non-grasping persona. This is a kind of humbleness that recognizes your place in the world is a very small part of a much bigger experience. You do what you can to improve and help the people around you. You fight and defend it if necessary, but it's only as a last resort. The opposite end is the grasping persona. This is the need to let people know what you have accomplished, how great you are, and how valuable you are to have in their group. I think a martial arts example would be, the guy that suddenly has inflated ranks and inflated certificates, and he goes from here to a super duper grandmaster over here. It's just trying to build up. And that's the lowland. The midland might be stolen valor. There's a former Navy SEAL named Don Shipley, and he goes all around the world to find guys that are posing or presenting their credentials as former SEALs, but they're not. And so he busts them and brings them out in the public. So stolen valor would be an example of the grasping persona. And finally, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Richard and DFD were able to identify the individual combative traits as seen in all systems of combat, but they pointed out the interaction of all of them in an encounter, especially in the midland and upland of performance, because it could result in what they called the transcendent synergy of the manifest adaptive traits, or TS of the mat. TS of the mat is the English equivalent of a Japanese term as Zanshin, which is a feeling of 360 degrees of situational awareness and a continual domination of a particular combative encounter. So you can see that rather than talking about TS of the mat all the time, it was just easier, faster for them to talk about Zanshin because, they were familiar with that term.
Yes. I think the movie clip captures that. I think it captures both the lowland and the highland in some ways, where in the beginning you see him completely hesitant and scared
Right.
to the transformation. I don't know, Sensei, the thing that stood out for me, and I'm curious about your take. We've discussed this in the past, but that you can reach that upland and that state of mastery and flow through anything. And if you know how to access it, then it can transcend the boundaries of the arts and the skills you have. And I think the Japanese have captured it really well in terms of a state of being to go after and to operate from there. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I always like to go back to actually what was written by Hayes to Don Draeger and then to me, because it's important. I'm doing my best to transmit this information from Richard Hayes to Don Draeger, Richard Hayes to Mike Belzer, to us, to everybody that's interested. And so these aren't my thoughts. I have my interpretation, but I'm trying to stay true to what Hayes was talking about. And I want to find a couple of outtakes from what he said here. He's what he talks about it's not a gradual, goes from the upland or from the lowland to the midland to the upland. He talks about it being like radio frequencies. Let's see here. It's funny when you have found
something, you don't find it.
You know where it is, but you can't find it. Well, one aspect that I've just run into here that I also want to bring out is just like there's system found, system free. There's also what he would call broad Goshen and narrow Goshen. Broad Goshen is, again, the lifestyle of the Bushi. They didn't walk around a corner without knowing, what was around the corner. They would do a wide angle around that. As they walk out a door, they look over their shoulder to see if there might be anybody behind them. In our daily life, it would be if we're driving, we put on the seatbelt. We lock the door, right? These are lifestyle choices that are embedded in what we do because we've either learned through bad experience or we figured it out by watching other bad experiences. This is what you do to stay safe. That's the broad defense. Every time I flip somebody off when I'm driving, I've just violated the broad self-defense format. If something happens because of that, it happened because I started it, right? And so Dick Hayes would call that a failure of broad Gaussian, sometimes results in having to do narrow Gaussian or actual physical techniques that you might have to use to defend yourself. He said, you may think it's too idealistic and theoretical, but it shows clearly that every instance of narrow Gaussian is a failure of broad Gaussian self-defense, a lapse for whatever reason or whatever excuse may be posited of Zanshin, moral Zanshin. Take your F and like it, no excuses, no mitigating circumstances. You are responsible for your students' F, not in the context of USA, good old WASP land of me, and also not me, but in the Bushi context of Japan at the very least. The graph, by the way, describes 0% narrow Gaussian and 100% Gaussian. For the Bujitsuka or the Budoka, every safe and secure moment of one's life and those near and dear is 100% broad Gaussian. Narrow Gaussian is a crude lapse and failure therefrom. And the failure does not rest upon X factor and X circumstance. The failure rests upon oneself. If one student is involved, also upon oneself, this applies to all sincere and viable Bujitsuka and Budoka. So that is, I would say, very idealistic. And I think there are some mitigating circumstances. Women's self-defense is a primary example. Women in general are targeted because they're women, right? And it doesn't matter necessarily what they wear, what they say, or what they do. All of those things might be contributing factors, but bottom line is they are targeted because they're women. Most men are not targeted for being men unless they're involved in a gang situation or some type of element of society that is creating problems. Nobody's targeting me because I'm a dude walking around, all right? What's happening to me is if I disrespect somebody, if I say something that might be misinterpreted or I might actually mean it, that can create a problem, might result in a physical confrontation. Okay, here we go. So regarding the upland versus the lowland or valley, I've been thinking how to characterize the difference between the two. There is no middle ground, it seems. By that I mean it's not a smooth continuum from lowland to upland, but rather discontinuity, a quantum jump, something like that. It's like a radio set with 2 or 3 bands on it. When you switch to a higher frequency band, there's a definite click. One band replaces the other, a total recalibration or a frequency span. Or like the channel selector switch on a TV set, total changeover. I don't think it's a gradualist thing where you work hard to eventually reach the goal. I think it has a constitutional basis. That's the genetic roll of the die, and may actually be a cluster of aptitudes. Aptitudes realized through circumstances, daily life, and or opportunities. Trying to account for this upland, I finally came up with the traits, and they do go a long way in explaining or expositing conceptually what's going on. They also do well regarding the lowlands. Most of the tapes Don sent me are on these subjects, on the traits and their expression. we spent months on problems until we reached a solution. I think that capsulizes it pretty well.
Yeah, I don't think can add anything to that.
So, our goal today was to talk about the concepts of system bound or system found and system free, and to also talk about these levels of human performance, in the combative context, the lowland, the midland, and the upland. And I think we've done a pretty good job there. It's important not to throw so much detail at people that they just
Yeah.
I can't handle it,
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that I haven't overwhelmed too much.
No, since I think this was great. I think especially given the number of newbies who are perhaps hearing about Hoplology for the first time, or have heard the word but have no idea where to begin, right? I think this will serve as a great way to say, okay, let me start to get a handle on the concepts. So I think this is a great place to close, and then in our next sessions we'll start going into these 8 traits that Sensei read out, that Hayes and Draeger pulled out and formed the guts of Hoplology. We'll look at what they had to say and perhaps throw in a little bit of how we see it in our own lives, so that we can go from what might seem as a dense language to someone not in that Koryu world, not in the classical Japanese world. They'll be able to say, okay, let's grok it. And the only thing I would say is, even if you're not in the Japanese arts, one of the big things that we are trying to do is build these bridges of understanding. So what we hope to do is that look at this and say, hey, here are some people who spend decades of their lives studying this and trying to figure out how to model this particular behavior. And what does a model do? It assists us in understanding things. So it is a great model then. It still is a very valid model. Some of you might want to add things, subtract things, but it still gives you a framework, a place to take off. So don't discount it.
Yeah, it's just new, and a lot of times people either resist the new, or it's not comfortable for them, and so it's better just not look at it. But it's important to know that even though this is coming from a Japanese perspective, Hoplology is not Japanese martial arts. The Hoplology is a worldwide study of human combative behavior, and nobody was a better embodiment of that than Don Draeger, who traveled all over the world, studied different systems, described them, and used Hoplology concepts to try to share his research with the world. And he made it a big point that Hoplology is not Japanese martial arts. They just use that as a window to look into the wider aspect of human combative performance.
Yeah, and just to add one thing to that, if you look at Draeger Sensei's later work, you see him dwelling into the work of Silat, and it was still this framework in a very different art, right? You're going from a very structured Koryu mindset, if you will, to a very tribal clan free flow method, and that way of applying and looking at it still worked. So it covers a wide spectrum, and what we are hoping to do is now take this into the European and Americana arts and say, okay, what can we learn from this? Is there things that we can extract from this and maybe refine a few things, maybe add to our own understanding? That's the journey. And like every model, it's a great starting place, a condensed knowledge of people who came before us. I'll save you a lot of time.
Yeah, and he did the same thing with the study of the classical Hawaiian martial art of Lua.
Lua, yeah.
He did that at the Bishop Museum when he was going back and forth to Hawaii for a few different years.
Correct. Well, with that, well, Sensei, thank you. I know we're at the top of our hour, and this was, as always, enlightening. And thank you for sharing this with the
Welcome.
much wider audience. And hopefully, we'll get a few more people nerdy enough and crazy enough to join this small group.
We're out there.
Yeah.
All right. See you next time.
All
Thank you,
right,
Bob.
Sensei. Thank you so much.
For some, it's the quest of an empire. For some, it's been the quest of power and riches. For some, the quest for honor. And yet for others, the quest for freedom. Blades and bladecraft have done just that. So Richard Burton has said, the history of the sword is the history of mankind. And that's the journey we are on. No blade culture has defined the world as much as the Spanish bladecraft. And yet, no art develops in a vacuum. It is shaped by those that it interacts and fights with, and also shapes the cultures whether they are conquered or manage to maintain their freedom. In this particular lab, we're going to look at how Spanish bladecraft influenced arts across the 5 continents. We've traversed 20,000 plus miles, brought in teachers with over 700 years of combined bladecraft experience, together in one place at one time, where over 3 days and 40 hours of non-stop training, you will be able to see and experience firsthand how it shaped Europe, how it shaped the bladecraft of Northern Africa, how it developed the arts, both indigenous and otherwise, in Philippines. Moving over to Latin America, from the jungles of Colombia and Panama, how the arts of machete developed. Coming further up north, looking at the arts of the southwest Mexicali region, where the long bulwark was developed. Or looking at the development of a very American form of fighting, the Bowie bladecraft. The impact on the Asian martial arts itself, with the Chinese art being completely transformed by fencing and fencing footwork. Lastly but not the least, is looking at the biomechanics of what full contact bladecraft does, how it shapes your movement and what works and what doesn't work. This is the experiment we embark on. The lucky few who come here will get a view of 500 years of bladecraft that developed across 5 continents, and the relationship between the conquerors and the conquered, between the wannabe conquerors and the freedom fighters, between those who fought as pirates and those who fought to maintain their honor. This is that experiment. This is holy blood, holy blade. For more information,